This video will give you an opportunity to practice using some of the advanced skills because there are opportunities for exercises and examples in the video. The video focuses particularly on three skills: transitioning, self-disclosure, and confrontation, and wraps up with a few opportunities to look at the self-awareness model and the feeling wheel. So you can fast forward, you can skip straight to the parts that matter for you, and you can definitely pause at particular places and attempt the exercises, and then the answers will be given in the next slide. So a couple of important things, or a few important things to remember about using these advanced skills. In every single case, you'll use them within the context of the three-step process. So the skill itself, transitioning, self-disclosure, and confrontation, is always in the middle step, and so is concreteness, but we've already covered that one. And you can use concreteness as a skill in the other steps, but to actually seek clarity using concreteness, that would be a second step. So the first step always involves paraphrasing what the other person has said, and you might even summarize and paraphrase nonverbal behavior, such as in some of the examples here. You might paraphrase the fact that somebody has repeated something or that they're looking at the floor. You might include that in how you reflect back. And even their paraverbal, such as the tone of voice or the speaking speed. It might also refer to behavior that has occurred before the current conversation, and that's going to become particularly important when we get to the advanced skill of confrontation, and you'll see why. In the second step, we deliver the advanced skill, which again are transitioning, self-disclosure, confrontation, or using concreteness to seek clarity. And you're going to do that by meta-communicating. Whenever you're meta-communicating, you're describing what's going on in your own head. And so you're going to use I statements to do that. And that can be difficult because first you have to have the thought and recognize it. And second, you have to remember to say it aloud. And it's kind of a weird thing to say, I am thinking or I am feeling. And don't forget that we do that with a degree of tentativeness so that if we're wrong, the other person feels comfortable saying, nice try, bucko, but not quite there. So your I statements are really important, and what you're describing is what your inner experience is, what your observations are, what your questions are, what your instincts are telling you. And then you wrap up the three-step process with the check-in. And check-ins are just another way of saying, ask a person an open-ended question. But they're not always questions. Sometimes they're actually better as statements. For example, you might not say, how are you feeling, which is an open-ended question, but you might say, tell me about that, or please help me to understand this, which are technically not questions. You'll need to remember that you have to be really clear with this three-step process, and that takes practice and it takes time. And so it's a normal thing to not get it right, and don't beat yourself up. You'll also start to realize that every person has sort of a natural individual voice. And at first you'll try using the things that I'm proposing. I definitely support you starting that way. Eventually you'll start to find little nuances that sound more like you. And as long as you don't completely abandon the technique to find those voices, that's fine. The second thing is you absolutely must understand the stages of counseling in order to do this work. If you don't understand what those 4 stages are for and how they look, then you'll have particular difficulty in the transitioning stage of things. So at first I recommend that people literally have a bit of a cheat sheet in front of them as they practice this. And by the time they get to the role plays where they're being assessed, they should hopefully have absorbed that. But that 4 steps of the counseling process, those 4 stages, can absolutely be reviewed like any other kind of academic material so that you go in really feeling comfortable with them. The first of the advanced skills is transitioning. And in this stage, or in this approach, what you're simply doing is letting the person know that you think you need to move into any of the other stages of the counseling process. And remember, that might mean moving backwards. For example, you might be in action planning with a person, and they start to say things that tells you they aren't really completely ready to action plan, that you don't know enough about their problem, and so you might move backwards into exploration. Another example might be that, excuse me, you're doing some action with a person and they start to actually not know what to do. They feel like they're unclear. You might need to stop the action, stop and go back and transition into planning and getting clear on that. And those are just 2 examples. Now, one of the keys of transitioning is literally just telling the person that you are using this technique. You are totally okay to tell them, I think we should transition. It's a really good idea to use that word when you're starting out, because now you know that you've done it. And explain what the transition is about. Why do you think we should go backwards? Or why do you think we should jump to action planning? Or why do you think we should evaluate the action the person did? Again, you're always going to use the three-step process whenever you want to use this technique, and you'll get sick and tired of me saying that throughout the day. And remember again that I statements are used to describe your inner experience in the middle. So that's how you're going to tell people what your thinking is. So here's an example, and I've broken it into the 3 steps, which I won't do in every example, but I want you to see them. So in the first part, Mike, you described how you have come a long way since your divorce, and I can hear that you are asking about whether or not it is wise to apply for joint custody. That's the paraphrase portion. I paraphrased his meaning or summarized what he said, that he's come a long way. That's a summary because I've condensed it. And I've also reflected on a pattern in his behavior, that he's asking about something, and it's sort of implied that he's done that more than once. So then I tell him my inner experience. It sounds like you want to start thinking about specific actions, so I think we should move into action planning. In this stage, I'll ask you to think about different approaches that you might take. Then we can evaluate them. Now, I'm obviously really slowing this down and breaking it down, but this would all be one continuous statement. You'll notice I've said why I think we should move. I've told him what happens in that stage, and sort of helped him to prepare. And then finally, a simple check-in. How does that sound to you? And you'll notice it's open-ended. It's tempting to say, does that sound okay to you? But that's actually a yes or no question. Occasionally we get away with that, but generally speaking, open-ended questions will work better, and I want you to practice using them. So here's a slide. I'll just zip through these, and you can practice these. Put them on the screen, pause, and write down your answers. And then the next slide gives you the answers. So pause and try your hand at these. Oops, here we go. This is the slide with the answers. So did you see these answers completely? I'm not going to really speak to all of them, but you can hear in this first one, I said, Judith, I heard you say that you don't feel ready. Then I said, I think it might be useful to go back to the exploration stage, and I needed to know that we were going from action planning, which is where the person was, because it says it right here, back to exploration. And I had to carefully decide whether to use the word back in most cases. And then I checked to see if the person was comfortable with that. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can pause and compare them to your answers. And if you have questions, you can feel free to ask me and test whether you're on the right track. Or even better yet, work with classmates and your role play partners. Self-disclosure is another advanced technique. It has a very specific and limited usage. It is only used when the other person seems reluctant to share, when you think the person isn't communicating because they seem worried about being vulnerable. That could be because they're anxious or shy or nervous. Could be that they seem afraid to talk about something because they might get in trouble. There is no other time when it is a good idea to use this technique. I don't care if the other person is telling you something that you go, oh, I have that in common with them. That's not enough of a reason. And if you do that, the problem will be with that other people think you don't have good boundaries, and then they will not have good boundaries. Also, they may start to wonder whether or not you are there for them rather than just talking about yourself. When we self-disclose, we always keep it super brief, we always keep it super general, and we focus on the feeling that we have in common, not on the specifics. In fact, your experience might not be exactly the same in terms of the mechanics of what happened, but it might be similar in terms of, or it should be similar in terms of the way you felt or the impact it had on you. Again, we use the three-step process, and again, I statements really are important in the second step. So here's an example. Virginia has been asked to talk about her experiences with addiction for the first time at a group meeting, and that's going to become important here. Rather than speak, she looked at the floor and is silent. Sorry, there's a typo there. And is silent for the next 20 seconds. Virginia, I can see that you are hesitating to speak. Now I'm paraphrasing what she did as opposed to what she said, because there's no words to paraphrase. I remember I named the behavior. I remember the very first time I was asked to share, and I was incredibly nervous. Now I am really not getting into details about what I shared or when. I'm focusing on the feeling. And then I do a check-in. Does that describe how you're feeling? So I have some questions here. Do you see the three-step process above? Did you notice anything I didn't say? What tone of voice and body language would be helpful as you said this? What kind of response do you think you might get to your question? And what might you say, there's a typo again, what might you say after the person responds? So pause the video and answer the questions with the last bullet point, and then in the next slide, you'll see whether or not you answered them completely. So these are the answers expanded from those questions. So did you see the three-step process above? Hopefully you did, with one exception. My check-in, although it was present, was not an open-ended check-in. Now, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't use open-ended questions, check-ins. I'm really important that you don't understand this as me saying there's not an open-ended check-in here. I'm showing you a variation because I want you to see that there are intentional times when I might change my practice a little bit. In this case, I did it because we're in a group setting and I don't think this person is likely to start talking about their feelings of nervousness at length. So I'm going to really make those choices with intention. That takes practice. It gets really hard at first to sit there and think and talk and think and listen at the same time. But with practice, you'll be able to hear Homie the homunculus as clearly and comfortably as you can hear the other person. So it takes practice, but you will get intentional. Now, hopefully what you notice that I didn't say, in addition to the fact that I didn't share all those personal details, is I also didn't offer any advice or reassurance. Sometimes those things become necessary after the person speaks to us, but they often won't. Often the action of just sharing how they feel and having you say, I understand, is just enough to get the wheel turning. Third, what tone of voice and body language would be helpful as you said this? It should be one that's warm, respectful, non-judgmental, and a really good word is gentle. But it should not be placating or coddling. Oh, I can see that you're having a hard time talking right now. You can imagine how it would be to receive that. It's not going to probably make a person feel more comfortable. It's going to make them feel treated like a child, and therefore they'll be more likely not to talk. So, what kind of response do you think you might get to your question? In this particular circumstance, I might expect the person to give me a one-word answer or a gesture like a nod, or even a sound like, uh-huh. Then I can use that to decide whether or not to go on to another question that's more open-ended as a follow-up, or a decision such as whether to let this person speak a different time. And again, this is an example of something I chose because of our context. In most cases, I wouldn't use this gradual approach if I was just one-to-one, but I can if I need to. So what might I say after the person responds? Well, depending on what they say, I might have a couple of options. If they answer freely, I might ask them a more open-ended question to get them talking further. Or I might simply give them options such as, would you like me to let other people go first? Or would you like to take a moment? Or would you like to write down your thoughts? Or would you like me to ask some specific questions? And I might even decide just to simply let the person not say anything. And there are times when a person just doesn't respond and I say something outward, and it's really important to meta-communicate. Oh my gosh, the typo here is pretty bad. It's from dictating. It says, no matter what I do, I'm not a communicator. It should say, I will be a meta-communicator, letting the person know what my reasoning is for my decision. So again, I will let them know what I'm thinking by meta-communicating. So I might say something like, okay, I can see that you're having a tough time. So I think I'm going to move on to somebody else just so that you can have a little bit more time to adjust. That might be an example of how I kind of took them off the hook if I felt that was the right approach. And don't feel bad if you don't get it perfect. Nobody ever does. Not in teaching, not in counseling. You'll have moments when you'll have to be honest with people and say, I think I wish I had done it this way. But you can't tell. There is no guarantee. So here are some for you to try. And again, I'll get you to pause. There are 4 this time. I want you to pause. Do your best by writing them down and then skip ahead to the next slide when you're ready to see how you did. All right, here are your answers, and you might be surprised. So number 1 and number 4 are the only 2 I'm going to look at here. You can do it on your own. Nikki, I can see you're taking a moment to respond, is my paraphrase. I used an I statement to describe my inner experience and to tell the person, again, there's a typo here. Oh my gosh, I thought I caught them. It should say, I know I find it difficult to feel comfortable when I am new someplace. And then a check-in, how are you feeling? So check and see whether or not those fit for you. Number 4, though, is very different. You'll notice that this one did not involve self-disclosure at all. Hopefully you caught it. Just because I haven't experienced the same as somebody doesn't mean that I should self-disclose. She is already telling me, and that should be all I need to know. Once I know that the person's comfortable talking, I don't self-disclose. Our last of the advanced skills is confrontation, and it is the most advanced. It's something that we should use only after we have got a strong relationship. The whole idea of confrontation is to understand it is about helping a person to explore themselves deeply, to get past what we might describe as roadblocks or discrepancies that we might notice, but perhaps the other person hasn't examined. It is not about telling people they're wrong or dumb or catching them in a lie. It is not about creating conflict. It is not about creating shame and blame. And if you do that, not only will they not work, but your whole counseling interaction with this person will disappear and you will leave them worse than you found them. So we have to make sure we have a strong relationship that's founded in trust and non-judgment. And we need to make sure the person feels like you're inviting them to understand themselves better. I love that word inviting here. And there are even times I use it in the confrontation. The discrepancies that people provide to us or show to us can be in the things that they say. They might say 2 things that don't fit for us, or they might have some nonverbal behavior that doesn't fit with something they do or something they say, and you'll see that in examples. Now, it's an interesting thing to me in our culture that sometimes we think we are being considerate or respectful to people by buttering them up. But if you examine your personal experiences, I think you'll find that is almost always the opposite of what happens. If somebody says to you something like, I'm going to tell you something that's really difficult to hear, but I really want you to do your best to listen. Or, I'm just saying but, or don't take this the wrong way, but, or I'm going to tell you something and I know you're going to handle it really well because you're such a good, receiver of feedback. In every single one of those cases, don't you feel insulted? And don't you start feeling yourself bracing for this? Don't you feel yourself getting dug in your perspectives or closing off? Those responses, those introductions, I should say, will create defensiveness. So instead, a more direct and respectful approach, a more direct approach is a more respectful approach. And again, we're going to use I statements, and we're going to go in the 3-step process. So here are the first of 2 examples. Darren, I hear you referring to your father as an idiot, and you've often talked about the way he showed disrespect to you and your mother. I paraphrase one of the 2 things that I have seen that don't fit. Then I had paraphrased the second. I also heard you talking earlier today about your mom using the term, that old cow. Now, if I'm talking with him, I would literally do like the finger quotes, or I would even say, I remember you saying, and this is a quote, because I want to be naming the behavior. Again, I want to be that concrete. Here's specifically what I saw. Now I use an I statement. For me, I'm a little confused about how those 2 things fit together. Notice the tentativeness and the ownership. I own that. It could be that I'm just dumb. It could be that I'm just missing something. I'm going to assume the person has some thinking. And then I say, help me to understand how you think about them. And you notice I put a question mark at the end here. It's a statement, but my intonation invites the person to tell me more. Here's a second example. Krista, I remember that when we first met, that you said your life was, quote, an open book. There's one area that we've been talking about where you've said you want it to remain off the table, and that's your weight. Now, again, I have reflected on 2 different things that people have said, or the person has said. In this case, though, notice that one of them's quite a ways back, could be weeks or months. And so I have to be gentle about that. Sometimes people don't like it when you bring back the past, but still, I think it's a valid commentary, especially if you have a relationship. Number 2, I'm curious about why that area is an exception in our communication. And again, you can see that there's some meta communication. I'm curious. I see it as an exception. You might even say something like, it makes it difficult for me to talk, and I really want to know how that is an exception in your mind. Then number 3, can you help me with that? So here are some things to notice here. Oh, again, there's a typo. It should say some things, not with apostrophe. In the use of confrontation, our paraphrasing again must include both of the items that we're seeing, and one of them might be from quite some time ago. The other one should be in the immediate moment, so that immediacy still plays a role. Be careful not to use the word but, and it's really tempting to use the word but we've learned it's a flag, and the word and is a really good substitute. Be direct, as I've already said. It's tempting to tell people things like, don't take this the wrong way, but that will backfire. And invite the person to explore their discrepancy. As I said, expect that you might actually need to give people time. And you can even say, well, I'm going to give you a moment to think about that, or let's come back to that next time we talk and see how much you've thought about it. These are great opportunities to ask people to journal or do exercises or go off and do a little bit of meditation, just to name a few things that get people to think about them. Sometimes it's homework I get people to do, and then the next time we talk, we explore it. And be prepared that they might actually say, oh, I have a completely logical explanation for that. You know, in the one that we did earlier, my mom really loves it. That's her nickname. She likes being called the old cow. You know, it might not make the way it makes sense in my world, but if that's the way that person is, then that might be what their life is like and fits for them. All right, some examples for you to try. And again, I want you to pause, try them, writing them out. If you're working with a partner, you might explore getting some feedback with them. All right, let's take a look at your answers. How did you do? I'm going to start with the first one only here, and then I'll let you look at the others as I've done the others. Carl, I noticed that you said you have stopped smoking. I can also smell marijuana when we are together. Now, the reason I did this example is because you'll notice how tempting it would be to say, but I can also smell marijuana. But I prefer to have two separate sentences, or and. And like you, I sometimes forget. Sometimes I say but, and the easy thing to do in that circumstance is go, oh crap, and start really meta-communicating with yourself. Oh crap, I said but. And unless the other person makes a deal of it, I normally just move on. Okay, continuing on. I'm confused about whether you are still smoking. So I just state my inner experience. I tell the person what is going on for me cognitively, and then I invite them to help me to understand. So try it. See how well your other two answers match with mine. Okay, now that's it for advanced skills. You're free to ask me questions, free to try the examples and see whether or not they fit, or put them on the Facebook post beneath this. A couple more things really quickly that are about self-awareness and using the terms. So I keep using the term work the model, and that refers to identifying the components, the 6 components in the self-awareness model. And by now you should have done that and got a little bit of experience. So let's see if you can do it with the subject being the keto diet. So take a look at these 6 things and pause and write down an example of each one for you. Next slide will give you answers. Okay, here we go. So a belief. A belief might be that diets don't work, or that the keto diet doesn't work. It's equally valid that somebody might see that the keto diet does work. Either way, it's a belief. A value. In this case, I chose a value. Health and nutrition matter to me. You might hear yourself using a different word. I put my health first, or it's important for me to eat a balanced diet. All of those things are demonstrations of value. Ethics. An ethic can describe a rule I have that makes me do something or makes me not do something. It's a rule for myself. Occasionally we express them as though they're for everybody, but we really aren't supposed to do that. So you should avoid diets might be the way some people do it, but what they really mean is I. And that's another really important tool I use in counseling. I heard you talking about you. When you talk about you, what do you really mean is something I sometimes dig into. But I digress. In this case, the ethic might be I avoid diets, but somebody might also say I make sure I eat a little bit of everything, or I have a vegetable, a starch, and a meat in every meal, or something like that. A thought. Now, thoughts can be beliefs again, so if I wrote diets don't work here, I would still be okay. I could use it twice. However, I want you to try practicing the model by thinking of a thought that isn't necessarily a belief, because remember, not all thoughts are beliefs. And so this one is an example. I think my friend Ike is on that diet, or I wonder if they have a book about that diet, or I wonder what the research on that diet is, or I know there's an article in a magazine. Those are all examples of thoughts. A feeling. I am worried my children will want to use the keto diet. I am angry that somebody is making money off the keto diet. I am concerned that my mother is using the keto diet. I am excited to try the keto diet are all examples of feelings. The action part in our afternoon session, a number of people confuse the ethic, which is a limit or expectation on your behavior, something you're going to make yourself do or something you're not going to do, whereas an action is specifically what you're going to do. So I'm going to talk to my children about nutrition, or I am talking to my children about nutrition, or I did talk to my children about nutrition, are all actions. But I will talk to my children about nutrition when they are born is starting to get more towards the idea of an ethic. It's important to talk about nutrition is a value. So the action I'm going to do is go and act on this. You might also have had actions like, I am going to eat only vegetables for the next 3 weeks, or I am going to buy the book, or I am going to say no when people ask me if I want French fries. I don't know why anybody would do that. Okay, so if you're not sure, you can check with me to see whether or not your examples fit, and you can also post them below, and you can also check with classmates. And finally, we're going to wrap up by talking about the feeling words part of things. Most people seem to be doing okay here, but remember, don't get duped by people saying, I feel, and then actually sneaking in a thought. I feel that the keto diet is crap was one that we had today. Well, that's not a feeling, that's a perception. And I'm quoting somebody, by the way. But the feeling they might have is, I'm angry about that. And the thought is, it's crap. But the feeling that suggests to me is, I'm angry or I am frustrated by people doing this. So I want you to see here that these words have different temperatures, that angry, for our first example, has a range of other ways we can help people to shape it. And we're working with people a lot on emotional intelligence, and that includes being able to find the words, find the correct fitting word for their feelings. So worried, angry, and afraid are the 3 I want you to try. Pause, and again, check to see how well you did with the examples I give in the next slide. All right, for angry, hopefully you had some like this: mad, annoyed, or frustrated. And you might have words that are colloquial or slang expressions like cheesed off or blue as top. And sometimes they're metaphorical. I feel like a volcano that is ready to blow up is a simile. Or I'm a raging torrent of emotion is a metaphor. You'll notice the word upset fits here, and we'll talk more about upset later on. Worried, the person might have said nervous, anxious, or again a metaphor. This is a simile technically, like a mouse at a cat convention, or butterflies in my stomach is a metaphor. And again, the word upset can go here. We'll talk more about it in a moment. Afraid, timid would be a mild example of afraid, low temperature. Petrified would be a high temperature variation of fear. And a metaphor or a simile, like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. I'm not sure why cats show up in so many of these, but they do. And look, there's that word upset again. So I want to talk very quickly about the word upset. Upset, when I'm listening to somebody with therapeutic skills, is almost always something that I want to dig into using my concreteness skills, unless the person on their own explains what they mean by upset. Because as you can see, it can mean so many different words. It's a bit of a placeholder word. It means just about anything other than happy. It can mean worried, angry, afraid, but it can also mean feeling guilty or feeling out of sorts. And in fact, one of the things that upset often tells me is that people haven't really sorted out their emotions. They haven't really kind of dug into them and helped to untangle them. The other thing it sometimes means is I'm overwhelmed or I don't even know where to begin. And those are also emotional states. You can also hear people talk about their feelings in this way. I don't know what to call this feeling, or I feel numb. And people sometimes talk about physical sensations. Technically, they are describing a feeling. But a very common thing in our work is that people don't know how to give an emotional name to what they're feeling. And a lot of time, the work that we will do will be most effective when we can help people to come up with an emotional name for the physical symptoms they're experiencing. This is particularly true with people with certain diagnoses, like developmental diagnoses like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and autism, or mental health issues like schizophrenia, which can create kind of a distanced persona. People who've been traumatized, people of different cultural backgrounds sometimes have less comfort with speaking about their emotions. Men, particularly older men, and sometimes young children that don't yet know how to name their emotions. So all of these can be useful as ways of taking what people are communicating to you through their actions, through a description of their physical symptoms, or even through things like art and helping them to come up with the names. For example, I've worked with people by giving them a temperature chart, literally a big thermometer or a wheel that had light pink all the way up to dark red, and helping them to stick a sticker on or point their finger at or draw where they were on that temperature chart. And then I could help them to learn how to name those feelings. So those are all important parts of dealing with therapeutic listening as well. Okay, this is a long one. Hopefully it's been helpful to you, and look for the handout online as well. And sorry about all the typos.